Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, Jesse Collings. I am here solo today for an episode that I have always wanted to do, but I never thought I would really, I never felt comfortable. I never felt like I could actually do it. And that is to have a Q&A with my listeners. I never really thought I'd have enough listeners, frankly, to do a Q&A. I certainly didn't in the past. But I put a feeler out earlier this week and said, hey, if people have some questions for me and they want to see me answer them in a podcast on audio, give them to me. And people were very generous and were able to give me enough questions and good questions at that for me to feel comfortable doing this. So I appreciate everyone who submitted questions. And hopefully this is something that I can do more frequently because I love answering questions. I love answering questions about wrestling. And it allows us to take the podcast and the conversation in a lot of different ways. So appreciate everyone who sent out the questions, and some of them were really thoughtful and things like that. So we're going to get right to them. I'm going to read them out loud and I'll tell who asked the question, and then we'll just get into the answers. And there's a lot of variety in here. A lot of it is about recent topics, some of the, recent news that's come out, some AEW stuff, some WWE stuff, some New Japan stuff, but also just kind of some general questions about my fandom. And that's always interesting to me, that people want to know like what my fandom is like and like why I'm a wrestling fan and things like that. It's cool to know that people are interested in that kind of stuff about you, I guess. And I don't have a problem talking about it. So we're going to get right to it. The first question I get, now, this is from Prince from the Voices of Wrestling Discord. Prince, I think, is from Finland. This podcast is huge in Finland. So most of these questions, I assume, are from listeners in Finland. So thank you to all my Finnish listeners. But Prince's first question is, what mistake have you done and how have you thought about improving and learning from it? Not that many people have answers to this, and I understand if you don't. What mistake have I done? And how have I learned from it? Definitely made plenty of mistakes. I'll probably make a mistake on this podcast alone. And I'm pretty reflective on that kind of stuff. I would say like I'll say a good one is a few years ago, probably like 4 or 5 years ago, when I was writing columns for Wrestling Inc. I wrote a column about Baron Corbin, and the headline was Baron Corbin, please retire. And it was just a 1,500 word piece just talking about how boring Baron Corbin was, how terrible of a performer he was, how awful he is on my TV screen, and I just want him to go away and I want him to retire. And it was very mean-spirited. And I wouldn't write something like that now. If I were to write something like that now, I'd be a little bit more cautious about the kind of wording I would use and the kind of language I would use. And it would definitely be wittier. This wasn't one of my best columns. I wrote it and it was just like, Baron Corbin's boring and he should just retire. And I wish he would just go away. And it wasn't like one of my strongest pieces. And I wrote it and I got published. And like a few hours later, Raj from Wrestling Inc. sent me an email and just said, like, look, man, I had to pull your Baron Corbin column. Like, you can't write stuff like that. And at first I was like really defensive about it. And I was like, what? I can't write that stuff? What's the point of me even having this column if I can't write like how I really feel? Baron Corbin sucks. And here's an article about why he sucks. And so I went to an editor of mine who was in the newsroom at the time. So I'm in my shoot job here working in a newsroom as a journalist. And he was a wrestling fan, and I had him read the column, and I was like, tell me if you think this is like too bad. Like, tell me that. And he read it and he like was like, I don't disagree with you. Like, I think Baron Corbin sucks too, but like you didn't have to say this. Like, I think I had a line in there that was something like Baron Corbin is like a corpse on my television screen. In fact, a corpse would be more entertaining, or something like that. And he's like, I wouldn't have like compared him to a dead body and stuff like that. And hearing it from my boss, he's not my boss, he was just an editor on the site. I wouldn't show my boss an article I wrote about wrestling. But he gave some critical insight and was like, yeah, like I wouldn't have written it like this. And he was a wrestling fan. So I think I wouldn't write that column now. I think I'm way more reflective on kind of what I write, and like if there's a way to be critical and there's a way to be even somewhat mean-spirited in your writing without going over the top and without just being so blunt with your opinions. It's not creative. And it makes it easy for people to dismiss your future work. I always try to write with the intent that I'm trying to make as cohesive of an argument as possible. I'm trying to write in a way that even somebody who might disagree with the general premise will acknowledge that I've made some good points. And that's not something that is always easy to do, and it's something that I've learned over time. So I think that's a good lesson. I think just for me personally, but for anyone who's writing and who's giving out their opinions, whether you have a spot to write, whether you have a podcast, whether you're just shouting out opinions on social media, I think that's an important lesson for some people to learn is that like there's a way to get your opinions across, and they can be strong opinions, they can be controversial opinions, and not be so blunt and mean-spirited, because ultimately it's not creative and it's not a super effective way to retain your readers, to entertain people, and to get your point across. So thanks for the question, Prince. The next question I have is from Twitter. Someone DM me on Twitter. This is Julian Brandt, who I assume this is the Borussia Dortmund forward, Julian Brandt, and not another Julian Brandt, but we'll see. He asks, what wrestling match have you watched the most? The wrestling match, like the full match that I've watched the most, I'm going to say is definitely The Undertaker versus Mankind from King of the Ring 1998, the infamous Hell in the Cell match where Mick Foley gets thrown off of the cell and he gets chokeslammed through the cell. And that's probably that's the match I've seen the most. A lot of it is because I had a DVD of the match when I was a kid. So, I mean, most matches that I've seen the most of are probably matches I had on DVD as a kid, because before the WWE Network and before stuff was really as accessible online as it would be, that was how you rewatched wrestling matches. So those are the ones that I've seen the most. And obviously that match is so entertaining. I can watch it today, no problem, even though I've probably seen it dozens of times. Because it's such a spectacle. It's not that long. The entrances are awesome. The start of the match is awesome. The commentary with Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler is awesome. Obviously, the spectacle of seeing Foley fall off the cell once, then fall off the cell twice, and then they actually have like a pretty good hardcore match after the two cell bumps, and it's just such an entertaining match. It's not the greatest match ever, but like I could listen to an argument for somebody that says that is that's the greatest wrestling match of all time, because it certainly has like the highest rewatchability from just a viewing perspective, because it's such a great spectacle, and really the kind of peak spectacle that I think people associate with WWE in their minds. So that one I've seen the most. I would say I'll say this: the Mitsuharu Misawa versus Kawada match from June 3rd, 1994, which came out one day after I was born. I was 1 day old when that match came out. And I didn't watch it live, of course, but I have seen that match a ton. And I have probably watched the closing stretch, like the last 5 minutes or so of that match, more than any other match. Like I will just, if I'm bored, like once every few months, just like put it on YouTube, skip to like, the 30-minute mark and watch that closing stretch, because it's really the peak of professional wrestling as far as I'm concerned when it comes to the crowd and the investment in the action and these two amazing performers and their ability to know how to sell and know how to not to sell and know how to fire up and know how to get people invested and just a world title that means so much, and just all that stuff. It's just like perfect execution of professional wrestling. It's not the spectacle that Undertaker and Mankind in the Hell in a Cell is, but it's more meaningful in a lot of ways because of just that that these guys are doing the art of professional wrestling and not just doing some hardcore spots. And not to discredit the awesome hardcore spots that Foley and Undertaker did, but it's just there's something more organic and natural about that. And so if we're just talking about like how much, like I don't watch that full match all the time, but like the closing stretch, I've watched a bunch of times. So I think that those would be kind of my two answers. But full wrestling match, definitely the Hell in a Cell match from King of the Ring. Brady from the Voice of Wrestling Discord, he asks, Warner Brothers Discovery has shown that they have at least some influence on AEW talent and booking with the Jay Briscoe situation. Do you think that their influence could cause issues in the future? They've caused issues at the start because of the whole Jay Briscoe situation. We know that they put their foot down and said, you cannot have this guy on television. And whether or not that impacted their ability to get Ring of Honor a television deal or not, we know that they've caused issues, right? But I guess the term issue is interesting here because ultimately, like Warner Brothers Discovery has a right to control what is going on their network, and they're paying Tony Khan a large amount of money to produce a wrestling product for their network. And it's the impetus is almost on Tony Khan to kind of put out a product that the network is going to approve of and not really push the boundaries too much or force Warner Brothers Discovery to kind of put their foot down. And I don't see a world where Warner Brothers Discovery is like meddling with the AEW product, where they're influencing a lot of what Tony's booking patterns are going to be, or they're suggesting ideas. We've heard that obviously with WCW. It was always kind of framed like Turner was like meddling. Who knows how much of that is true, right? Because a lot of that information's come from people like Eric Bischoff and Vince Russo, who are liars. But we've seen like USA Network has kind of influenced some WWE booking decisions. I think like USA was really big on like the 24/7 title, and that was why that was created. I don't see Warner Bros. Discovery like having a huge problem with like the product that AEW is presenting. I think you could argue that maybe have they pushed back against some of the language? Have they pushed back against some of the amount of blood that's been on the screen? I think there was a report that's saying that they didn't like the number of strong swears that were on AEW, people saying shit too much on AEW, and that's been curtailed. I don't really see that causing an issue, though. I think that's just them kind of putting out like, this is the TV-14 boundary that you have. Please don't push it. I see that just as kind of normal business as usual. I don't see them influencing really AEW in a really dramatic way. Obviously, they have a huge role to play in the success of AEW with their network and their ability to advertise AEW and their ability to reach homes and things like that. And we'll see what happens during the television negotiation season. But I don't see them having like a massive influence on the product or really causing too many issues with what Tony Khan wants to do with the product. I mean, Tony has, I think, really pushed the boundaries of what wrestling we see on television. It's pushed the boundaries on how violent wrestling can be on television. It's pushed the boundaries on how many good matches we can have with wrestling on television. It's pushed the boundaries on kind of the different types of talent and the different types of styles of wrestling that we see on television. I think all of that shows that Warner Bros. Discovery really has kind of a hands-off approach to the actual product of AEW. The Jay Briscoe situation really being the only time I can think of where they really put their foot down and said, absolutely not, no, not this guy. Maybe there are other instances that have happened that we don't know about, but I think in general, they're pretty, hands-off when it comes to AEW, and it's for the better. I don't think any of us really want our television networks influencing the wrestling product, because ultimately the people of the television networks are not going to be capable of positively influencing a wrestling product because they're not wrestling people by and large. Tail Avery asks, who are some of the hidden gem stars of New England wrestling from before the Vincent Kennedy McMahon era? Good question. If if you're interested in this. One of the thing about like wrestling in New England and the Boston area history is, if you're just looking at wrestling history in general, I think most people who consider themselves historians of pro wrestling or fans of earlier eras of wrestling, a lot of them are stuck looking at the territory era from like the late 1960s through the 1980s, which is looking at this era where most wrestling was on television. It was probably on during the lifetimes of the fan that's talking about it, the historian that's talking about it. And so in New England and the Boston area, that was all during that time period, it was all WWF. It was, it was Vince Sr. and it was Vince Jr. So the gems, the stars of that era are WWE stars, WWF stars, WWF stars, whatever you want to call it. Bruno Sammartino, Killer Kowalski, Gorilla Monsoon, Captain Lou Albano as the manager. All of these guys, Bob Backlund, Pedro Morales, Ivan Koloff. Those are the stars of like what most people would consider like the territory era of pro wrestling. And so you don't really hear that much about New England wrestling history before the WWF, because that's really coming from like the late 1950s and back, which there's just not as much coverage of pro wrestling history in that regard, because most historians don't go back that far. And locally, there's not a lot of discussion about pro wrestling. So if I were to say like who are some of the hidden gem stars, I can't really tell you hidden gem stars, like people that were like on the undercard of these eras, but I could talk about the bigger stars from the pre-Vince McMahon, pre-WWF era of pro wrestling. Boston and the Boston area for the first half of the 20th century was one of the biggest wrestling cities in the country and in the world. Paul Bowser, who was the promoter in the Boston area for a really long time. I want to say he was the promoter. I'm going to look it up right now, but I want to say he was the promoter from like 1910 to when Vince McMahon Sr. comes in the late 50s. So Wikipedia is telling me that he started as a promoter in 1922 in Boston, and he stopped being a promoter in 1960. So really, exactly the entire span of what most people would consider the wrestling history in Boston. The Boston Garden, the original garden, is built in 1928. That's when you can really point to like wrestling starting in Boston as like a big deal, as far as like a big box office attraction. And some of the biggest stars in pro wrestling were around then. I mean, Jim Londos was a prominent star in Boston. He was the greatest drawing card in perhaps in wrestling history, and certainly during the first half of the 20th century was the biggest drawing card in wrestling history. Some really interesting like experiments taking place in Boston. Paul Bowser's wife, his wife was Cora. I can't remember her name now. That's gonna drive me crazy. I should have had this prepared because I had Cora Livingston. That was her name, Cora Livingston or Cora Livingstone, one of those two words. He was his wife, and she was a women's wrestling champion, kind of like one of the first real women's wrestlers in like the 19 teens. And so like women's wrestling was kind of prominent in Boston, at least more prominent than it was in most other parts of the country where it wasn't even featured. And so he starts there, obviously. And so that's one of the things that he does. And he was allied with like Billy Sandow and Ed Lewis and the Goldust Trio, with Jack Curley involved, and kind of that whole connection that controlled wrestling. But he was kind of the Boston, New England promoter. And there was a lot of innovation going on at the time. So like I said, Cora Livingston was his wife, so there was more women's wrestling, but a lot of things like that really were transformative in the wrestling industry. Gus Sonnenberg, who was a popular football player with the Providence Steamrollers, an old NFL franchise in Providence. And Gus Sonnenberg was kind of like the Bronco Nagurski. I mean, I say that like Bronco Nagurski is not a dated reference, but he was kind of like the big football star of that era in the of the NFL, and he wrestled in the off season, and Paul Bowser used him as an attraction, and he was kind of the first, real non-hooker, non-grappler attraction in pro wrestling. And there was, of course, controversy about he wasn't a real shooter. He didn't really know how to wrestle. It was all fake. But he became a really big star. I think he was the biggest drawing card in wrestling during a period in the late 1920s. And he popularized the flying shoulder tackle, where he just basically came off the ropes and tackled the guy like John Cena would. But at the time, that was like seeing like a double rotation moonsault. Just no one had seen wrestling kind of like that. And of course, some people said he was fake, and some people said made wrestling look coordinated, and all the same stuff that people say about innovative wrestling now. But at the time, he was hugely popular. After him, there's Dano O'Mahony, who was an Irish immigrant that Paul Bowser found and began promoting. Gave him basically kind of like a version of like 1935 Bill Goldberg. Would basically got him really green, strong athlete, but very green. Obviously didn't know how to like actually wrestle, but they booked him really strong. He came in and he was immediately over. He was the biggest star in wrestling, I believe, in 1935 and 1936. I'm just doing this off the top of my head, so those years might be wrong, but he was a massive star. Then he worked the Boston Garden, he worked Braves Field, he worked Fenway Park. They were running stadium shows. He had a famous stadium show match against Jim Londos, where he wins that era's version of the world title from Jim Londos. Really took the title away from Jim Londos as like the biggest drawing star in pro wrestling. And he was kind of a trendsetter. Not only was he kind of like the first guy that really got pushed to the moon despite having no real notable athletic background or wrestling experience, but he was also this huge ethnic star to the Boston Irish community, which I'm a part of, and was really became like this big ethnic hero and kind of paved the way. Like Jim Londos was also an ethnic hero to Greeks for sure, and there were other wrestlers kind of before Dano O'Mahony, but Dano O'Mahony really became the model for finding territory bookers, seeing their ethnic group that they had at their disposal, and it depended on where you were. In Boston, it was Irish. In New York, it might have been Italian or Puerto Rican. In Chicago, it was Polish. You would have an ethnic star, and you would push them really hard, and they would get really over because the fans, people were first generation immigrants, second generation immigrants. They were more connected, I think, with their ethnic background now than back then than perhaps they are now, depending. It obviously depends on your ethnic group, but I'm pretty far removed from my ancestors coming over from Ireland. But back then you weren't, so it was like having an Irish champion, a good Irish boy as your champion, was a big deal. So Dano O'Mahony obviously is probably, in my opinion, like the biggest star at his peak in the history of Boston pro wrestling. It's either him or Bruno Sammartino. But he flames out really quickly. He does a famous match with Dick Shikat in New York, where Shikat just basically shoots on him and wins the world title, and kind of exposed Dano O'Mahony, and things go downhill from him from there. He actually dies in an automobile accident not that long after that. I think he was under 40 years old when he died. It's a really sad story, but it's a really fascinating story. Other stars in Boston, there's Steve Casey, who's kind of like the replacement for Dano O'Mahony, another guy from Ireland who was a champion rower, was really like a world-class rower, like could have gone to the Olympics for rowing, won all these international competitions. And he lasted much longer than Dano O'Mahony, but again, similar idea, which was like this big, strong Irish guy beating up other people. But a very successful draw for Bowser in New York City. I mean, other people, there was some French Canadian wrestlers, Maurice Tillet, who is the French Angel, who people probably recognize him if they see his face. He's the guy who was allegedly his face was like the model for Shrek. He had the same disease Andre the Giant had. I'm gonna mispronounce it. It's like acromegaly or something like that. But he had like a distorted face basically due to his physical condition, but was a really successful monster drawing heel in all over, really. I mean, he's a gigantic star from a drawing card. He wasn't really that much of a wrestler, but as far as like a monster heel, he was a big drawing attraction, and he was big in Boston in the 1940s. A fun guy that maybe people don't know about, but is a fun little trivia question, is a wrestler by the name of Henri de Glane. He was from France originally, and he won the Olympic gold medal in Greco-Roman wrestling. I want to say he won it at the 1924 Olympics in Paris, if that sounds right. He was like a heavyweight Greco-Roman wrestler, and he won a gold medal. So unlike a lot of these other guys like Dano O'Mahony and Steve Casey and Maurice Talay, he was a legit wrestler, legit shooter, right? He literally won the Olympic gold medal in wrestling. He was a pretty good draw in Boston. There was a huge French Canadian population in Boston, so there's a lot of French speaking wrestling fans and things like that. So he was a big star. He's just kind of a fun trivia question because everyone thinks that Kurt Angle is the only Olympic gold medalist in the history of wrestling, and certainly the only Olympic gold medalist that was a big star. That's not true. Henri de Glane, also a big star in pro wrestling, and also an Olympic gold medalist. It was 99 years ago he won the gold medal, but it's still kind of a fun little trivia question. And then from there, I mean, after that, it's really it's Bruno Sammartino, who obviously is comes in with the WWF and Vince McMahon Sr., but Bruno, like, people talk about like Hulk Hogan and Steve Austin and The Rock as being like, oh, household names. They took wrestling mainstream, and they're like, someone who doesn't know anything about wrestling would be able to name Hulk Hogan or things like that. And that's true from a national perspective, right? They were the first wrestlers to become household names across the nation. But I think that kind of discredits the impact that someone like Bruno Sammartino, or pick your whatever your regional hero, maybe it's Vern Gagne in the Midwest, or the Crusher in Milwaukee, or Jerry Lawler in Memphis, or Freddie Blassie or John Tolos in Los Angeles. Like, if you ask certain people of a generation in Boston, and I'm sure this is true in New York and certainly in Pittsburgh, his hometown, like, they might not know anything about wrestling, but they'll know who Bruno Sammartino is. Like, my dad never really watched wrestling, but he knows who Bruno Sammartino is. He was a household name in the Northeast. He was obviously a huge hero in the Italian community, being a native of Italy. And obviously the Northeast has a huge population of Italian Americans, but even people like my dad who weren't Italian, like, loved Bruno Sammartino. Like, he was a real regional icon, and he was a household name. And I think people kind of get dismissive about that when we talk about the territories. We talk about, the smoky arenas, and we talk about, these guys who were trying to, bilk fans out of money and pretending it was real. And wrestling is so much bigger and grander in the modern era because, people are household names and they're in arenas and things like that. It's really not true. I mean, Bruno Sammartino was selling out the Boston Garden a couple times a year. He wasn't in a bar. He wasn't in a smoky arena. I shouldn't say that. There was probably plenty of smoke at the Boston Garden in the 1960s. But the point is that he was a huge star. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that, and people are too dismissive of these previous eras of wrestling. Like Dano, even to go back further, like Dano O'Mahony, him and Jim Londos had a match at Braves Field that like shut down the city of Boston because the traffic was so bad. So you want to tell me that, like, okay, that those guys weren't big stars, that those guys were wrestling in bars and armories and things like that? It's like, no, they had a stadium show that was so big it shut down the city of Boston because the traffic was so bad. To be fair, the traffic is always bad in the city of Boston, but the point is that, like, people kind of get too dismissive about these eras of wrestling that they ultimately know nothing about, and just dismiss it as saying, oh, it doesn't matter. Oh, it was just this small time thing. And it's like, that wasn't true. That wasn't true at all. These guys were all huge stars, and it deserves to be recognized. I don't know historically, like, where we're going to be with that kind of stuff. But I appreciate the question. That answer was way too long. but thank you, Tail Avery, for it. Common Sense on Twitter, he asked, what are the chances that Tony Khan looks at other potential streamers for Ring of Honor's Honor Club if Warner Bros. Discovery only wants AEW? Where would you think would be a good fit? Well, clearly Warner Brothers Discovery only wants AEW. I think if they wanted Ring of Honor, they would have Ring of Honor. I'm sure that decision was up to them. The question here is, did Tony shop Ring of Honor outside of Warner Brothers Discovery? Tony's been very protective of his relationship with Warner Brothers Discovery. There's been some speculation that would Tony try to sell this to someone else other than Warner Brothers Discovery because they're so tight and together. I don't know if that's true. I mean, he would be within his right if he offered this to Warner Brothers Discovery and they said no. He would be within his right to do that. It's just to sell it to other people. Did he? I have no idea. I don't really know how to begin to even speculate on that. But it's definitely something that happened. Where would I think they would be a good fit? That's a tough one. I mean, I kind of like the concept of Ring of Honor being on a streaming service. Because it would meet another kind of audience that the AEW product isn't hitting. Like if they could be on HBO Max, I think that would help them. It would get people who maybe don't have cable that want to watch a wrestling product. Boom, they've got, a wrestling product that's good production and good talent and quality product, and it's available to them on a streaming service and don't have to have a cable subscription to access it. I think part of that's attractive to me. That's probably a more realistic landing spot, if I'm being honest, because they're not limited by like prime time hours and things like that. I think if you look at the landscape of television options, if they're not with Warner Bros. Discovery, they're probably not going to be with a Comcast affiliate because of their relationship with WWE. So you can rule out all, NBCU channels. So where does that leave you when it comes to like major cable channels? You're looking at like the Viacom channels, with CBS operated channels and Sony channels. Like MTV. I always thought wrestling on MTV would be kind of an interesting concept. It would seem to kind of fit in with the image they're going with. And I know they dabbled with it in the past, but I always thought that would be interesting. Like put them on MTV at 10 o'clock at night and see what happens. I think that maybe could be an option, but I think ultimately Tony didn't get a good offer, and that's why they're on Honor Club, which my opinion on the Honor Club thing with Ring of Honor Television going to Honor Club is that the intent is for it to be a short-term, non-permanent stay in Honor Club. It's where Ring of Honor is going right now. But Tony is still going to be actively looking for a proper home for it that has someone paying for Ring of Honor. I do think the Power Slap coming on after Dynamite, and I know in their debut they lost like 70% of the Dynamite lead-in almost immediately. I know the ratings were better for week 2. Maybe it will take it. Maybe the clips on Twitter and stuff helped to take off, but I think that could be an interesting thing to monitor. If Power Slap like totally flops, maybe Warner Brothers Discovery comes back to the table and says, no, we're looking for something to put after AEW. Power Slap was a dud. I don't know how much money they spent on Power Slap. I bet you it's more money than they would have to pay to put Ring of Honor on their station. But obviously, I think Ring of Honor would do a better job than Power Slap at holding the audience, at least at first. And it might be something they might look at saying, man, this Power Slap thing failed. Tony, who is someone that I presume that Warner Bros. Discovery trusts, has this wrestling product for them ready to go. They might jump at that. So I would keep an eye on like Power Slap, and I would keep an eye on what's happening and the shifting things that seem to be happening at Warner Bros. Discovery. We always kind of talk about it like it's potentially bad for AEW, but I could see it being this thing where they're looking at the landscape and looking what they do have, and that is AEW and certainly on Wednesday nights providing the the most popular show on cable outside of NBA basketball. I would say, maybe they look at it saying, you know what, we should get into bed. We should get more invested with them, and we should be looking at maybe adding more wrestling to our program. I mean, that's what's happened with a lot of WWE stuff, is that WWE, even if you argue the WWE's ratings had been going down over the years, USA was like, we want to have more wrestling on our network. Raw's 3 hours now. NXT, put it on our network, 2 hours on Tuesday nights or Wednesday nights. They are looking at that kind of stuff. Total Bellas, Total Divas, put that on E. Hidden gems and the wrestling biopics and the A&E biography series and that kind of stuff. They just want more of the wrestling stuff because they know that it's proven to be a valuable commodity to them. So I could see Warner Bros. Discovery looking at AEW's ratings, being satisfied with them, looking at what their other stuff is doing, and saying, maybe we should reconsider this. If Tony, I'm sure Tony would be happy to get it on Warner, on TBS or TNT, for sure. So I think that could be that would be my most, honestly, the most likely scenario. I could see HBO Max, TBS or TNT, or maybe True TV or one of the smaller Turner stations. I could see being the most likely landing spot for Warner Bros. Just for Ring of Honor. I don't see them going on ESPN. I don't see them, maybe, like I said, MTV, just from a culture standpoint, seems to make sense. I have no idea if they're interested in wrestling or not. But those would be the likely homes, if I were to guess. Andre on Twitter asks, how do you explain to people when you talk about wrestling that you like AEW more than WWE? I have a hard time explaining to people who only know WWE. I assume you're kind of talking about when you bring up wrestling, or wrestling is brought up and they mention WWE, and you're like, oh no, I kind of like AEW, not really WWE. How do I explain that to people? I think the simplest way to put it is to put it in terms, if people are not wrestling fans, or they're not really big wrestling fans, and they want to talk to you about it, which is good if people are earnest about wanting to know more about it, is to put it in terms that are easy for everyone to understand. I like to say it WWE is this promotion that was once very successful, but they've just been around so long, and the product is stale, and the characters don't resonate with me, and the action seems limited by comparison to other wrestling that I watch. And I think AEW does a better job than that. I mean, that's my personal opinion on the matter, but that's how I would explain it to people. If I'm trying to get them to, I don't know if I'm trying to get them to watch AEW, but trying to explain to them why this product that they've never heard of is better than this product that they have heard of. Because I get it. A lot of people just think their whole knowledge of wrestling is just WWE, which is what happens when WWE owns the market for that long. I mean, I would explain it best to people ultimately the biggest line in the sand for me is WWE's characters are cartoonish. They're full of melodrama. They don't feel like realistic people that I can relate to. And AEW's characters do. They feel more human. They feel the emotions that they experience seem to be more realistic to me. I can relate more to their characters than I can with WWE's over the top, often comedic characters. And that's what resonates with me as a wrestling fan. Some people genuinely want the cartoonish, over the top Vince McMahon style of pro wrestling. That's why they enjoy WWE so much. But I would try to put it into terms that you don't have to be a wrestling expert to understand, because we can go into 5-star matches and rewarding storylines and not having excessive camera cuts and all these things that we talk about, these more nuanced conversations we talk about when we talk about the differences between the two products, but focused more on the the how someone who watches any TV show can relate to it. I think it's pretty relatable to describe WWE, especially when Vince was still in charge of creative, as yeah, this guy who was once pretty funny. It's like having a TV show where the writing was once really good, but they get burned out and they get old, and it's harder for them to relate to people now, and it's now a lot worse. That's how I would sell it. I would relate it to like any TV show or even like a sports team. It's like, oh, there was this, WWE is ultimately a team that once had a coach who was innovative and on the ball, who slowly lost their ability to do that, and now they are just an old fart who can't keep up with the times. So I think it's easy to kind of relate WWE's like kind of rise and collapse to people who don't really know that much about wrestling, because it's so similar to experiences in other forms of entertainment. Um, so that'll be my recommendation, for all you people that are having those challenges out there. Maybe it's just Andre, but I get it. I get the question that he's asking. JGM asks, do you think the Bloodline story will be remembered fondly or will age poorly years down the road? Do I think the Bloodline story will be remembered fondly or will age poorly years down the road? Obviously it's impossible to know, but if we're going like 20 years into the future, looking back on it, how will people see the Bloodline story? It will probably depend on how they stick the landing with this Sami Zayn thing, but I think in general, I think it is going to age well, and I think it will certainly be remembered fondly. And the reason I think that is because it really it's been Roman Reigns and the Bloodline and the Tribal Chief and this angle has been going on for so long. It feels like a very important key moment in Roman Reigns' career, in the history of WWE in general. Like, this is the era where Roman Reigns held the title for a gazillion days and was this dominant heel champion. And if you're looking at Roman Reigns' career, I think when we look back on it in 20 years, people are not going to remember the period of time between like Roman Reigns post Shield and Roman Reigns Tribal Chief, which seems hard to believe because we all recently lived through it and we remember the years and years of Roman failing to get over as a babyface and getting booed and the fan resentment and running off of all these fans. And it's been talked about so much over the last 10 years. But over time, I think people are going to forget about it because it wasn't a successful aspect of his career and it was really forgettable. Like, yeah, he headlined WrestleMania and he won all these big matches, but like people aren't going to remember those. Like, people aren't going to remember the Roman Reigns Undertaker match at WrestleMania. People aren't going to remember the 10 million Roman Reigns Brock Lesnar matches that took place during that time period, or Roman Reigns beating Triple H for the title at WrestleMania. Like, even though these are the quote unquote big moments in WWE history, I think because he wasn't really over and the what he was doing was so uninteresting to a lot of people and drew such apathy from fans, that people aren't going to really remember it. So when we look back on his career, we're going to see like, oh, he was in the Shield, and then when he went solo, and then he was the Tribal Chief. I think that's how most people are going to remember this in 20 years. Not now, because we're way closer to those years where he wasn't over. But in 20 years, I think we'll look at it and be like, oh yeah, like that's what happened. Like, it's gonna, the rest, what he did in between those two things was so forgettable. It's hard to even remember what happened, and it was only a few years ago. So I think in 20 years, the Bloodline story is going to stand out as this paramount moment. Will people be deconstructing it? Will people be, in 20 years, will there be a podcast that goes week by week analyzing the Bloodline storyline the way there are like people analyzing the Monday Night Wars or the NWO or the rise of Steve Austin? There probably will be a podcast dedicated towards that. It'll be interesting to see, like, in 20 years, do we look back and analyze it week to week and realize that not a lot actually happened over this 2-year span? Maybe, but I think it's going to be remembered fondly. And for the people, especially for the people who like it now. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of it, so like I'm not going to be like sitting in my rocking chair in 60 years and being like, God damn, I can't remember. I remember when I was a young kid and I acknowledge the Tribal Chief. I don't know why I'm Southern when I'm old, but that was my old man voice. And apparently I'm going to be moving to the deep South and adopting an accent pretty soon. But I'm not going to be like that. But I think for the people that are fans of it now, the people who are calling it high art now, people who are calling it Shakespeare now, obviously, it's going to be remembered fondly for them. But I think from a historical perspective, it's going to really stand out in what has otherwise been a very forgettable time period for WWE. And that's why I think it's going to be remembered fondly. Isle of Man guy This podcast is also really big on Isle of Man. It's like Finland, the Isle of Man, in the United States are like the three biggest, I think, areas for this podcast. But Isle of Man guy, he's got a couple of questions. I'll try to answer these quickly. What territory wrestling have you watched? I'm not like one of those guys who will just sit back and watch like a year's worth of consecutive television from a territory. I'm not going to watch Mid-South wrestling week by week for a year. Um, I don't really have like a territory where I would say I've watched a lot of in specifics. I really just go around and watch big matches, and I watch a lot of promos from other territories and other eras. Um, but I would say like a lot of my territory stuff comes from reading. If I'm being perfectly honest, it comes from reading. It comes from reading books, um, and reading old observers and things like that. That's where I feel like I like history. It's obviously helpful to watch and see, things that made tape, especially the promos. But I feel like I read a lot more than I watch. But I would say like as far as stuff I like to watch, like um, you know, Jim Crockett Promotions for sure is just stuff that's aged really well. AWA stuff hasn't aged as well, but the promos in the AWA are awesome. Like the wrestling is kind of hit or miss, but the promos, like old superstar Billy Graham promos in the AWA, um, Nick Bockwinkel promos, Bobby Heenan in the NWA, Mean Gene in his interviews in the AWA. That stuff's aged really well, and I've watched a decent amount of that stuff. But I'm not the guy you want to talk to when it comes to like watching a lot of territories and knowing all the characters of Memphis wrestling or knowing all the characters of Eddie Graham's wrestling in Florida. That stuff has never really appealed to me. Reading about it for sure, but like spending time to watch is hard. I think in general, and this kind of goes back to like the what match have you seen the most question. Like, I don't really like going back and watching wrestling because there's so much wrestling happening today, and I constantly feel like I'm behind. And there's so much, and it's so easy to access. And there's wrestling happening in the United States and in Europe and in Mexico and in Japan and in other places. It's so hard to keep up with, and I'm constantly behind. I don't have the mentality to like watch 2 hours of some wrestling show from like 1986. That's not how I choose to spend the limited amount of time I have to watch wrestling. So I'm really not the person to ask, I would say, about that. I'm sorry if that makes people think less of me as a wrestling historian. I apologize. Um, and he asks, favorite match from these companies in their history. So he asked for four. He lists four companies here, so I'm going to go by one. New Japan Pro Wrestling, my favorite match in New Japan Pro Wrestling history. There's obviously a huge selection to choose from. But if I were to just say one right away, I would say Kenny Omega versus Kazuchika Okada, the first one from Wrestle Kingdom. Their subsequent matches, a lot of people feel like are better. Some people like the 60-minute draw. Some people like the faster match during the G1. Some people like the match where Kenny Omega finally wins the title. I think that first match to me was a really like transformative moment for New Japan Pro Wrestling and myself as just like what I appreciate in wrestling. The energy in the Tokyo Dome that night, the hype for that match. Like I can remember so leading up to that. So what again, so my other favorite New Japan matches are the G1 before that Wrestle Kingdom. He wrestles Haruki Goto in one night to kind of win his block and go to the finals where he wrestles Tetsuya Naito, which he wins. Like those two matches back to back were both like 5-star matches, like perfect matches from Kenny. And I really feel like Omega had hit this new level as a performer. And he had all this momentum, and he's going to the Tokyo Dome, and he's wrestling the greatest wrestler in the world, Kazuchika Okada, who's already had a bunch of memorable Wrestle Kingdom matches before. In that match, like there was so much hype for it, and I didn't watch it live. I remember I had to like work really early the next morning, so I spent the entire day at work ignoring news sites, ignoring social media. All I heard was my editor once said, who knew I liked wrestling and watched New Japan, says, I heard Omega and Okada had a hell of a match this morning. I'm like, yeah, I'm sure they did. I don't tell me any spoilers. And I remember I went home and I watched it right after work, and I just remember being so engrossed in it. And I am not like a really reactive person when it comes to watching wrestling. Like I don't cheer. Like even when I'm at shows, I don't really clap or cheer or chant things. Like I just like watching wrestling. I'm not hugely like either physically or mentally emotive when it comes to appreciating wrestling. But I was watching that match in my living room, and because when Okada hits the Rainmaker after like 40 minutes, and he hits the Rainmaker, and you're like, oh man, he's gonna lose. Kenny's gonna lose. And then Omega kicks out. Like I leaped off my couch and like fist pumped. I was so happy that Kenny Omega kicked out. And it wasn't like I wasn't really like rooting for Omega going into the match. I was just hoping the match would be great. But when Kenny kicked out, I was so happy. And that's honestly I think like the happiest moment I can remember, like emotionally being invested in a match, was that moment when Kenny kicked out of that first Rainmaker, because I bought the finish and it was such a surprise when he kicked out. It was like the perfect reaction. And I really don't get like that with my wrestling. Um, so that to me is my favorite New Japan match. I think if I had to pick another match, I really like the Antonio Inoki Vader match from I think 1996. It's like Inoki's last great match, and it's an incredible match because it's old Inoki who's in good shape for his age, but he's old Inoki. He's kind of broken down, and he's wrestling Vader, who's just this massive super heavyweight, maybe the best super heavyweight of all time, and certainly when it comes to just being a menacing figure. And Inoki has like, this special aura with him and this connection with the fans, which can never be duplicated. Uh, and Inoki beats him with a roll up, and it's just such a fantastic wrestling match and such a great story that's being told. And if I were to pick one that wasn't from like the modern era, like the peak New Japan era of the 2010s, I like that Inoki versus Vader match. All right, WWE favorite WWE match in history. I'll hear an argument for that Mankind Undertaker match, but I would say WWE. I'm a huge fan of the WrestleMania 13 Steve Austin versus Bret Hart match. Again, it's like perfect professional wrestling. I've seen it a bunch of times. It never fails. Austin's so perfect in it. Bret's so perfect in it. The double turn where the crowd believes, starts believing in Austin because he's just such a charismatic, intense figure. He's so much better than every single person on the WWE roster except for Bret. Like really, if you watch WWE in like 1996, 1997, like Austin he's so much more charismatic. He's so much more intense. He's so much more emotional. He's so much more lively than just all of these other dull figures. Even someone like Shawn Michaels, who's, doing his like Chippendale dance routine and stuff like that. And he's out of his mind on promos because he's on a ton of drugs. Like Austin is just so alive as a performer, especially when he was just kind of harnessing that Stone Cold character. The Survivor Series match they have with Bret in 1996 is like amazing, and then that WrestleMania match with the double turn is perfect. And I mean, it's been done to death since, but there really isn't a better finish than Steve Austin passing out in a pool of his own blood, refusing to quit to the sharpshooter, like to solidify that, like, goddamn, this Steve Austin guy, he's a rascal, he's a snake, he doesn't care about anyone except himself, he'll do anything to win, but you gotta respect his toughness. He passed out instead of tapping out. It's like the greatest finish ever. And that's a match I've watched a bunch of times and never fails. Always like a perfect wrestling experience. Yes, for All Elite Wrestling, there's so many. I think the one for All Elite Wrestling to me is the Young Bucks versus Kenny Omega and Hangman Page at, I think it was Revolution 2020. Again, like a perfect pro wrestling match. The storytelling and the emotion, Young Bucks working as heels, and there's a great like sit down interview. I think it was with Jim Ross before the show. It was like on the Dynamite before Revolution, and it's the Young Bucks talking to Hangman Page, and the Young Bucks are really dismissive, especially Matt, of like Hangman like having some negative feelings towards the Young Bucks and basically just blow off Hangman and say, why do you have this chip on your shoulder? We found you in Ring of Honor. We brought you to New Japan and we brought you to All Elite Wrestling, and you should have no problem with us. And just the dynamic of like the Young Bucks hating Hangman and specifically Matt hating Hangman more than Nick, which is like a fun dynamic where Nick, he's not a huge fan of Hangman, but he's trying to reel in his brother because Matt's like losing his mind because he hates Hangman so much. And you've got Kenny as like the bewildered veteran trying to play all sides and keep everyone together. But they're having this match, and it's the storytelling and the spot where Kenny Omega goes for the one-winged angel, but he can't because his back hurts. So then Hangman Page hits the one-winged angel. It's all this stuff that people say allegedly these guys don't do. They don't know how to storytell. They don't know how to sell anything. All this stuff that obviously they're just doing it way better than everyone else. There's obviously a bunch of great AEW matches, and I kind of think that one is might be like getting lost to history a little bit. I'm a little concerned about that one. I think when you look at the definitive matches in AEW's history so far, I think people will remember the Cody Rhodes versus Dustin Rhodes match, which was kind of like the first truly great AEW match. I think people will think of like CM Punk and MJF and the dog collar match. Maybe they'll think of something like Anarchy in the Arena from this year. Maybe the first Stadium Stampede for what, how unique it was. That match, that Hangman Page and Kenny Omega match versus the Young Bucks from Revolution, that to me is like the peak of the wrestling in that company. And I hope like we can look back in like 10 or 15 years and that match like still has like legendary status. I think AEW's had so many great matches since that it sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, but that to me is the number one AEW match in history. And the last one he says is Ring of Honor. Ring of Honor, I don't really think I have a definitive answer on. I love the Bryan Danielson versus Nigel McGuinness match. I think it's for the pure title. I want to say it's from ROH Drive. I'm a Nigel guy. Like, I think like Nigel in his prime is better to me than Bryan Danielson, which I know is like a controversial take. And Bryan Danielson obviously has a much lighter resume of matches, but like if you were like, which one of these guys would you rather see have like they're wrestling a really good wrestler? Who would you rather see? I'd rather have Nigel. I just think he was so tremendous at incorporating the British submission style with his personality and his selling, and he would yell in his matches in his Nigel British voice, and I don't know, something about it. He was one of the first independent wrestlers that really grabbed my attention, and I can't really shake that. And it's a shame that his career wasn't as popular and as successful as it could have been, because he was every bit as good as some of these guys that have had so much success in recent years. But his match with Danielson is awesome. Some other Ring of Honor matches. I saw the best match I ever saw live, I'll tell you, was from I can never remember the name of the show, but I want to say it was from a Ring of Honor show in 2018. It was in Lowell, Massachusetts. It was a triangle ladder match. It was the Young Bucks versus Daniels and Kazarian versus the Motor City Machine Guns. I sat front row for it. It was an unbelievable spectacle of a show. It gets the live bump from me as far as how good of a match it was. I know it's not like a super legendary match, but to me it was the best wrestling match I've ever seen in person. It was at that Ring of Honor show. So that one definitely stands out. Do Fixer versus Blood Generation, the famous Dragon Gate 6-man tag match from one of the WrestleMania weekend shows, which I've heard people say that match hasn't aged that well because it was the first time a lot of people had seen kind of Dragon Gate style wrestling and the speed of these guys and the quickness of their tags and how many moves they were doing. And I think since that match has happened, more people have watched Dragon Gate, but more importantly, that style has permeated throughout America and the US Indies and PWG and all these other promotions, that it doesn't stand out as much at the time as where it came across as this hugely transformative moment for American wrestling. And no one had ever seen moves like this. No one had ever seen the complicated, moves executed so perfectly between these two teams. So I've heard people say the match has actually aged poorly. I disagree. You go watch it. The crowd is losing their mind the entire time with what they were seeing. The wrestling is great. I mean, there's so many great wrestlers now. You got like young Dragon Kid, young Genki Horiguchi. younger Yankee Horiguchi. It's such an excellent wrestling match. So yeah, those would be the ones for Ring of Honor. Ring of Honor's got a ton of like, they don't to me have like that one signature standout match, but they have a ton of just amazing matches in a really great variety. They've got great tag team matches. They've got great like hardcore plunder battles. They've got great technical wrestling. It's just Ring of Honor really at its peak provided so many different styles of pro wrestling. I mean, the Samoa Joe versus Kenta Kobashi match, which is probably the most famous match in Ring of Honor history. The energy from the crowd and just like how into it that built the you know, the hardcore fans of Ring of Honor were. At some point, Ring of Honor, part of it was the crowd miking turned to shit, but like at some point they lost that kind of energy at their shows from like the 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006 era, where it wasn't quite as big as it would later become, but the fans there were so passionate and they were so loud. And they were seeing Joe and Kobashi fight each other. It was just like that energy in that building is so incredible and intoxicating and so intimate because the crowd's not that big, but it's in a smaller venue. That stuff to me really stands out. And lastly, from Isle of Man guy, things you'd like to see Tony Khan do this year. The number one thing I'd say I'd like Tony Khan to do this year is really, and we're really seeing this already, even though it's still January, really elevate that kind of next generation of talent. I don't want to say necessarily move away from like your John Moxley, Chris Jericho, Bryan Danielson, Kenny Omega kind of stalwarts as top single stars, but really kickstart that next generation of talent that has kind of been slow simmering and on the back burner for a while. And you're definitely seeing like MJF being the champion is the perfect example of like, obviously we're focusing on the next generation of stars, the homegrown AEW guys, not guys who were big stars that came to AEW. But besides MJF, like you're seeing that with Ricky Starks, I think you're starting to see, you know, Darby's is being pushed more. I think Jack Perry is being pushed more. Swerve Strickland, I think, is a potential huge star for them that you're starting to see kind of elevated up the card a little bit. I think they're really focusing on those guys more. And that's what I would recommend. I want to say it helps AEW maintain its own distinct identity. It's not just a promotion relying on stars from other places, and it helps create more variety and unique matches. And I really look forward to the day, and it's probably coming pretty soon, and hopefully it will come this year, where AEW main events a pay-per-view with two, you know, homegrown wrestlers and not someone who was a big star somewhere else. I mean, they've had things like, you know, Kenny Omega versus Hangman Page, which, you know, is not, you know, doesn't have a WWE star involved. So it's, you could argue it's two homegrown guys, but those, you know, especially Kenny were big stars before they came to AEW. I'm thinking of like an MJF Ricky Starks or MJF versus Jack Perry or MJF versus Darby Allin or some combination of those guys main eventing a pay-per-view. I think that would be a really good moment for AEW, and that's something that I'd like to see Tony do this year. And when I say do, I mean, don't just do it to do it. I mean, get those guys over enough where you feel confident to do it and it feels like it's a big match and not just like you're checking a box like, oh yeah, we'll do this. We'll have a match that doesn't a main event's a pay-per-view with two homegrown guys and we can market it like that. I mean, anyone could do that, but do it the right way. Do it in a way that feels organic and natural and worthy. That's what I'd like to see this year from AEW. Emmy from Twitter says, if WWE sells to Saudi Arabia, do you think it will open a realistic window for AEW to become the number one brand in terms of viewership and engagement? I don't think it does, because I think if WWE is sold to Saudi Arabia, I think WWE will maintain its television presence, at least for now. And so as long as they have that television presence, whether it's on USA and Fox, or maybe they go somewhere else, maybe they go to NBC or something like that. But as long as they have a strong television presence, it's going to be really difficult for AEW to like match them for viewership and match them for engagement. Because I don't think a lot of WWE fans that are watching the product regularly are going to stop watching the product because of Saudi Arabia. I don't think your typical WWE fan is in tune enough to draw that line. Now, does it make it difficult for WWE to get a television deal if they're owned by Saudi Arabia and they're seen as like, you know, this arm of the Saudi Arabian government, which is what they'll be if they do sell? That remains to be seen. A lot of people will point to Live Golf, the Saudi Arabian funded golf league that's a competitor with the PGA Tour. Really couldn't get, despite having, all of the biggest stars in golf for the most part, couldn't get a television deal that was worth very much. I believe they ended up taking like a time, like a time buy or an ad split with the CW is the best they could do. I don't see that happening with WWE because WWE is, the market leader. It's not the established. It's the established brand. It's not a new upstart being funded by the Saudi Arabian government. It is the market leader. It would be like if the Saudi Arabian government bought the PGA Tour. That happened, then I think that they would still have very lucrative television deals that they have now with like, ESPN and NBC and CBS. So I don't think the Saudi Arabians owning WWE will be seen as a big enough negative for them not to get a prominent television deal. And as long as they have that, they're going to hold on to that lead over AEW in terms of viewership and engagement. Is it possible for AEW to ever become number one in terms of viewership engagement? Anything's possible. I think there's a potential angle out there that will could get so hot and so over that Dynamite is regularly beating Raw and SmackDown in the key demo and total viewers and things like that. That's obviously possible. But as far as Saudi Arabia being a direct link to causing that, I don't think that's going to happen. And the last question we have here, this has taken much longer than I thought it was going to, but that's because they've been such good questions and I've given such long answers. But the last question here is from Alan 4L. And Alan asks, with TV Asahi seemingly not too fussed about being involved in New Japan Pro Wrestling's expansion outside Japan, and Tony Khan obviously quite keen on some kind of New Japan USA Ring of Honor joint venture, what do you think is the best case scenario for all involved, and how would you structure it if you were advising? This is a very thoughtful question from Alan. I've thought a little bit about it, and I've thought, if I'm New Japan Pro Wrestling, I don't want to be associated with Ring of Honor. And the reason I don't want to be associated with Ring of Honor is because Ring of Honor is going to have this label. I know Ring of Honor can be a very good show. It can be a very good product. It can have a lot of people working very hard on it. But I don't want to be associated with a second-rate AEW product. I don't. I don't want to be like this. I want to be associated with AEW. And I want if I'm going to be providing some level of talent, I want to be, working with Chris Jericho and Jon Moxley and Kenny Omega and Bryan Danielson. I don't want them working with whoever is going to be on the Ring of Honor roster. Because I don't think those guys are going to be on the Ring of Honor roster. Maybe they would have been if they got a TV deal and Jericho was still a champion, but he's not. They took the title off him and they've moved Ring of Honor away from kind of the main focus, the main guys in AEW for a reason. So if I'm New Japan, I'm thinking that if I want to have a relationship with AEW, I want it to be with, if I'm going to have a relationship with Tony Khan, I want it to be with AEW. I want it to be with their biggest stars. And I want to be seen, I want to have my Forbidden Door show where my best wrestlers are wrestling your best wrestlers and they're trading wins and that kind of thing. I want to be seen as a major entity on the level of AEW, not this entity that's working with the B-level AEW, which is how Ring of Honor is going to be perceived. New Japan's USA model is interesting because it seems like they're, New Japan Strong doesn't seem like they're going to produce more episodes of that. And so what do they want to do with New Japan Strong? I have no idea. If we're talking about New Japan's impact in the United States, I think they're associating with AEW and having those strong relationships with AEW, specifically the main roster, has allowed them to make some more inroads. We know that they lost ground during the pandemic and they lost ground during, the early days of AEW with Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks not being associated with New Japan Pro Wrestling. But I think in the last year or so, they have done a better job selling tickets. They obviously have the Sasha Banks deal, which has helped. But I think, getting your guys on American television, getting, Okada out there and 1 million people seeing him, or, Minoru Suzuki or Tomohiro Ishii or whoever you have, getting those guys on American television and giving them an environment in AEW where they're going to be presented as stars and moderately protected is a big deal. I mean, I think it's really notable that Minoru Suzuki appears on AEW television, and then he is, able to do a big indie tour of the United States. It's because he was on AEW television and he got a character over, and now that character has demand on the indies, so he can go to these indies all over the United States, and people know who he is, which maybe wasn't the case when he was just in New Japan. Certainly, some fans knew who he was, but being on AEW gave him that platform. And I think that's a valuable platform for New Japan Pro Wrestling. I think it's always been kind of strange. I think I want to see more AEW guys in Japan. I think like it's great that Omega did Wrestle Kingdom. It's great that John Moxley has been, doing some shows for New Japan. But I want to see like a team like Top Flight work the, Super Juniors Tag League. I want to see someone like, Sammy Guevara being the best of the Super Juniors. I want to see, or Jungle Boy. I want to see Bryan Danielson work the G1, or maybe even someone who could just take a lot of losses in the G1, like Daniel Garcia, but come across as a bigger star having worked it. I want to see more of that. As a fan personally, just because I think there's a lot more to offer, and it would really help it would be very helpful to the talent to get that experience in Japan. It would also help diversify New Japan's product, which can sometimes be stale because they're relying on a lot of the same matchups, particularly in the junior heavyweight division. I mean, AEW's got an incredible amount of talent, from their biggest stars to young rookies who would fit the junior heavyweight requirement in New Japan and could be brought in and help diversify that show and diversify those matchups. I'd like to see more of that happening. I think it's like Darby Allin was at the Noah show working, in the Muto match, and came across like a star, and it seemed like the crowd was into him. And obviously that's Noah, that's not New Japan, but it kind of proves that you can take a guy from AEW, and if he's good, and we all know Darby's very good, he can get over in Japan. People want to see him again. And I think that's super beneficial to your talent. And I think it's beneficial to your brand as AEW to know that your guys are seen as global stars. Like it helps Kenny Omega's aura in AEW that people know that he's this really big star in Japan. Like that helps give Kenny this global aura that not everyone else has. Even if you're not watching those Japan matches, if you're a fan and you're like, oh yeah, Kenny's a legend in Japan, like that helps Kenny Omega get over as a star. And I think having more people that are seen as global successes is important to AEW and should be something. So if I were to advise it, I would say I wouldn't do the New Japan and Ring of Honor. I wouldn't do really a lot with New Japan and Ring of Honor unless New Japan is doing a lot with AEW. I have no problem with Ring of Honor being a home for some of the New Japan strong types. If you want to put, Filthy Tom in Ring of Honor, and you want to have some of the LA Dojo guys and some of the young boys from Japan, you want to get them in some experience. Working in the United States, like as a kind of a lower level Ring of Honor thing. But I don't want to see like Okada in Ring of Honor, or Tanahashi or Naito or Will Ospreay in Ring of Honor necessarily, even though I'm sure they'd have great matches and great programs and things like that. If I'm a fan, I want to see those guys in AEW. I want to see those guys in the main event. I want to see those guys at the very top of the industry of what they can accomplish, not necessarily in Ring of Honor. So that's what I want as a fan, but I also kind of been looking at it as with the idea of what I think would be best for business. So thanks for the question, Alan. And that's going to do it. I appreciate all the questions that were submitted. Hope I gave good answers. Hope I gave relatively concise answers. Some of them got pretty long, but again, I really appreciate everyone who's wanted to submit a question and values my opinion enough to want to hear an answer to a question that they have. So thanks for everyone who is listening. We'll be up again in a few weeks, but I appreciate the continued support of this podcast, and I will talk to you all later.